In an alternate reality, let's imagine what would have happened if Hurricane Katrina hit New York City instead of New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina, which made landfall in the Gulf Coast in August of 2005, was one of the most destructive natural disasters in United States history. New Orleans bore the brunt of its fury, but what if the storm had shifted east and directly struck the heart of New York City? The Big Apple, known for its iconic skyline, bustling streets, and dense population, would face a completely different set of challenges compared to New Orleans. New York City is home to over 8 million people, making it one of the most densely populated urban areas in the country. The sheer number of people would be a massive hurdle for evacuation. In the case of a storm like Katrina, people would need to leave the city quickly, but with so many residents, that would be incredibly difficult to manage. Highways, bridges, and tunnels would become clogged with traffic, and public transportation would be overwhelmed. The complexity of evacuating so many people would cause chaos, and not everyone would be able to leave in time. In addition to the challenge of evacuation, New York's infrastructure would face extreme stress. The city's subway system, which serves millions of commuters daily, would be at risk of flooding. The city's tall skyscrapers, which are a hallmark of its skyline, would also be tested by Katrina's intense winds. With wind speeds reaching over 170 miles per hour at its peak, these buildings could experience significant structural damage, and even windows could be shattered by flying debris. On the streets, residents would feel the effects of the storm surge. New York's coastal areas, including Lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn, would be especially vulnerable. The storm surge, a massive rise in sea level caused by the hurricane's strong winds, could flood these low-lying areas, including key parts of the city that are home to many of its most important buildings and businesses. As the storm surge hits, floodwaters could push into the subway tunnels and submerge underground stations, making it impossible for the transit system to function properly. The surrounding streets would quickly become rivers, turning daily life into a chaotic scene. Another challenge would be the city's unique geography. Unlike New Orleans, which sits below sea level, New York City's elevated areas could provide some protection from the initial storm surge. However, those high-rise buildings would act like wind tunnels, amplifying the storm's ferocity as gusts raced through narrow streets. The combination of flooding, strong winds, and the threat of falling debris would put immense pressure on the city's emergency response systems. The city's first responders, firefighters, police officers, and medical teams would be stretched thin, trying to save lives, restore order, and prevent further damage. Emergency shelters would be a necessity for thousands of displaced people. Given the scale of the disaster, setting up enough shelters for millions of residents would be a massive task. Relief efforts would need to be organized swiftly, and supplies such as food, water, and medical supplies would need to be distributed immediately. But with the entire city's infrastructure in chaos, delivering these essentials would be no easy task. In this early phase of the storm, New York City would be facing extreme weather conditions, rain pouring down relentlessly, wind howling through the streets, and the distinct sound of windows shattering as debris flew through the air. The immediate priority would be to secure people in place, offering shelter where possible, and then trying to get ahead of the floodwaters before they overtake the city. The city's residents would need to find safety wherever they could, whether it be in tall buildings or stronger, more secure structures. Evacuation plans would quickly shift into rescue operations, with emergency teams going door to door, searching for survivors in flooded homes or people trapped on the streets. As the storm approaches, New York would be preparing for the worst. It's not hard to imagine the chaos in this bustling city as it faced the might of Hurricane Katrina, one of the strongest hurricanes ever to make landfall in the United States. The stage would be set for a disaster of unprecedented scale, and the question on everyone's mind would be, how would New York City survive the storm? As Hurricane Katrina continues its approach toward New York City, the storm's full power would begin to make itself known. By now, the city would already be facing the initial brunt of the disaster: rain, wind, and rising waters. But the worst would still be to come. With winds sustained at over 170 miles per hour and the storm surge pushing coastal waters to unprecedented levels, New York's low-lying neighborhoods would soon be overwhelmed. The financial district of Lower Manhattan, home to Wall Street and countless other key institutions, would be at the forefront of the damage. Flooding could reach several feet deep in these areas, submerging office buildings, residential, apartments, and underground utilities. Financial markets would be shut down, businesses would be forced to close, and any economic activity in the city would come to a standstill, given New York's role as one of the world's major financial centers. The impact of this would ripple out across the global economy, with financial markets around the world reacting to the city's shutdown. As the storm surge pushes further into the city, the impact on transportation would be even more severe. New York's iconic bridges and tunnels, which help connect the boroughs, would become lifelines for evacuation, but they too would be put to the test. The bridges might remain intact, but flooding would make many of the tunnels impassable, further stranding people who had hoped to flee. Without the subway system, which typically transports millions of people every day getting anywhere, would be a monumental task. With streets already flooded, getting out of the city would become impossible for many. For the people left behind, navigating the storm would become an increasingly difficult and dangerous task. The strong winds would tear through the streets, toppling trees, light poles, and even buildings. Debris would be flying everywhere, creating dangerous conditions even for those who were trying to find shelter. The city's population, already under stress from flooding, would face an additional threat in the form of these flying hazards. Every street, every block would become a potential danger zone as winds gusted through, shattering glass and sending debris in all directions. The storm's flooding would affect more than just Lower Manhattan. Areas like Brooklyn and Queens, especially those near the waterfront, would experience significant water damage. While some parts of the city sit on higher ground, the sheer volume of water being pushed inland would make it difficult for even the most resilient parts of the city to avoid flooding. Residential areas along the rivers, such as those along the East River and the Hudson River, would see massive water inundation, potentially swallowing entire blocks. At the same time, power outages would be widespread. The storm's intensity would take down power lines, knocking out electricity to large sections of the city. In many cases, this would leave neighborhoods without basic services like lighting, refrigeration, and air conditioning. Without power, heat would become unbearable, and essential communications would be interrupted. Hospitals would struggle to maintain operations without backup power, and emergency services would find it difficult to coordinate without the use of radios, phones, or computers. In the midst of all this chaos, the city's emergency responders would face unimaginable challenges. With roads blocked and tunnels flooded, first responders would have to rely on boats, helicopters, and other specialized equipment to reach those in need. Search and rescue missions would be underway as emergency teams attempted to reach people trapped in flooded buildings, especially in high-rise apartments or homes along the water, while the city's fire departments, police, and medical teams would be doing their best to help. The sheer scale of the disaster would make it difficult to save everyone. At the same time, the psychological toll on New Yorkers would be profound. In a city known for its hustle and bustle, the sudden stillness of an evacuated or half-submerged city would create a surreal scene. People who had never seen their city this way, flooded, abandoned, and dark, would have to adjust to a new reality. As they huddled together in shelters waiting for the storm to pass, they would also wonder how they could possibly rebuild after such a devastating event. The emotional impact of Hurricane Katrina hitting New York would be felt far beyond the immediate destruction. It would redefine the city in ways no one could anticipate. By this point, the city's streets would be unrecognizable. The skyline, which had once stood as a symbol of New York's resilience and strength, would be obscured by dark clouds and swirling debris. Even if the winds started to subside, the damage done to buildings, infrastructure, and homes would be immense. With every new flash of lightning, the full extent of the destruction would be revealed. Roads torn up, buildings collapsed, and floodwaters inching higher. As New Yorkers braced themselves for the storm to pass, the real work of recovery would be just beginning. As Hurricane Katrina begins to move further inland, New York City would find itself facing the aftermath of one of the most destructive natural disasters in its history. The storm, which has already wreaked havoc on the city's infrastructure, would leave the city reeling with the daunting task of recovery. The first priority would be ensuring the safety of the city's residents. With many neighborhoods still submerged under floodwaters, the authorities would have to continue their efforts to rescue people from flooded buildings and evacuate those who are still trapped. The damage to the city's infrastructure would be catastrophic. Roads, bridges, and tunnels, essential for both evacuation and transportation, would have suffered severe damage from the storm's flooding and high winds. Major roads leading out of the city, like the FDR Drive in Manhattan and the Long Island Expressway in Queens, would be rendered impassable, with debris scattered across entire stretches of the highways. Even as waters begin to recede, the damage to the roadways would make travel impossible, further complicating the evacuation process. While the city's subway system typically serves millions of commuters each day, it would be particularly vulnerable to the flooding. With water pouring into the underground tunnels, the subway system could be rendered inoperable for weeks or even months, severely limiting the city's ability to function normally. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority would face a Herculean task to repair the extensive damage done to the system, and this would have a lasting impact on how New Yorkers travel throughout the city. For a city so dependent on its public transportation, this disruption would be a blow to its daily life. In addition to the damage to the transportation network, New York's iconic high-rise buildings would also suffer significant damage. Many of these buildings are constructed with glass facades, which would be easily shattered by the hurricane's fierce winds. The impact of the winds could cause windows to break and debris to fly through the air, creating dangerous conditions for those still on the streets. Some buildings, especially older structures or those located near the waterfront, may have sustained significant structural damage, and there would likely be widespread reports of fires breaking out due to the storm's effects on electrical systems. While efforts would be made to restore basic services, power outages would continue to affect large parts of the city. The loss of electricity would leave residents without air conditioning, street lighting, and other essential services for days or even longer. The city's hospitals, already stretched thin, would have to rely on backup power, which may not be sufficient to handle the influx of patients requiring urgent medical attention. It is likely that the healthcare system would be overwhelmed, and many residents would have to wait for days to receive necessary care. Another significant challenge would be the contamination of the city's water supply. With floodwaters mixing with sewage, chemicals, and other pollutants, the water supply would likely become unsafe to drink. Residents would need to rely on emergency water distribution centers set up by the authorities, but getting enough clean water to everyone in need would be an ongoing struggle. Sanitation would also become a concern, as the city's waste management systems would be disrupted, further complicating efforts to maintain public health. The city's economy, already facing the immediate aftermath of the storm, would be deeply affected in the long term. Major industries like finance, tourism, and retail would be severely disrupted. New York's financial markets, which were shut down during the storm, would likely remain closed for several days, if not weeks. The disruptions in the global financial system would ripple out, affecting economies worldwide. As businesses try to recover from the damage, it would take months or even years for many of them to return to normal operations. Even as the city rebuilds, the economic toll of the storm would be felt for a long time to come. The human cost of the disaster would also be felt in the loss of life. While the full scope of the casualties would not be known immediately, the number of people displaced from their homes and forced to seek shelter in overcrowded facilities would be staggering. Thousands of residents would lose their homes, and many would be left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Finding shelter for such a large number of displaced people would be a monumental task. Emergency shelters would be established across the city, but space would be limited, and conditions in these shelters would be far from ideal. People would struggle to find basic necessities like food, clean water, and medical care, all while grappling with the emotional toll of losing their homes and possessions. The psychological effects of the storm would also be profound. For New Yorkers who had witnessed the storm's destruction firsthand, the emotional scars would last far longer than the physical damage to the city. Many residents would be dealing with post-traumatic stress, as well as the grief of losing loved ones or their homes. For many, the trauma of Hurricane Katrina hitting New York City would forever change how they view their city and their lives. The city's recovery would be a long and difficult process. The scale of the destruction would require an unprecedented effort to rebuild. Government officials, business leaders, and ordinary citizens would have to work together to restore the city to its former glory. The challenges of recovery would extend far beyond just rebuilding homes and businesses. New York would need to rethink its approach to infrastructure, disaster preparedness, and climate change, as the reality of living in a city that could be vulnerable to hurricanes would be impossible to ignore. Over time, the city would heal, but the scars left by Hurricane Katrina would forever be part of New York City's history. As New York City begins the daunting task of recovery, the focus would shift toward rebuilding the infrastructure and addressing the long-term impacts of Hurricane Katrina. The city's leadership, alongside state and federal officials, would work to coordinate relief and recovery efforts. While there would be a massive influx of resources, the process would take years, with many areas still struggling long after the immediate aftermath. One of the major concerns would be rebuilding the city's transportation system. The subway system, which had suffered extensive flooding, would require a complete overhaul. Many of the tunnels would need to be cleaned and repaired, and the electrical systems would need to be replaced. This process could take months or even years, and until then, the city's residents would have to find alternative means of transportation. Bus services would be increased, but with the subway out of commission, traffic congestion would worsen. Many commuters would likely opt for ride-sharing services, adding strain to the city's already congested roads. The rebuilding process would also extend to the city's utilities. Restoring electricity to the vast and densely populated boroughs of New York City would be a monumental task. Power outages would persist in some areas for weeks, especially in Lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn that were hit hardest by the flooding. The city would need to improve its electrical infrastructure to ensure future storms don't cause the same level of damage. A focus on reinforcing power grids and backup systems would be essential. An investment in renewable energy sources might become a higher priority to reduce the city's dependence on vulnerable power stations. In addition to the physical reconstruction, the psychological impact of the disaster would remain an ongoing challenge. New York's residents, many of whom had already lived through the trauma of the September 11th attacks in 2001, would find themselves grappling with a new layer of fear and uncertainty. Mental health services would become a critical part of the recovery process, with counseling and support available for those affected by the storm's devastation. Schools, churches, and community centers would become essential hubs for healing, providing residents with the support they needed as they processed their experiences. The economic fallout from the hurricane would be felt across every sector of New York City's economy. The tourism industry, one of the city's largest sources of revenue, would suffer as travelers canceled trips, fearing continued disruption. Hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues would take a major hit, especially in the areas that had been most affected by flooding. Many businesses, particularly small ones, would face the difficult choice of whether to close their doors for good or attempt to rebuild. The unemployment rate would likely rise as businesses struggled to get back on their feet, and the city's workforce would face uncertainty as a result of the disaster's long-term impact on the economy. Insurance claims would pour in, but given the widespread damage across such a large and densely populated area, many insurance companies would struggle to cover the enormous costs. This could result in lengthy delays in compensation for homeowners and business owners, further exacerbating the financial strain felt by those affected by the storm. The government would step in to provide disaster relief, but the scale of the recovery effort would require sustained efforts from all levels of government. Amid all the destruction and rebuilding, the city would begin to rethink its approach to disaster preparedness. Hurricane Katrina's impact would leave a lasting legacy on the New York City's planning policies. The city would invest heavily in improving its flood control systems, building stronger seawalls and levees to protect against future storm surges. Zoning laws may also change to ensure that new construction is more resilient to flooding and high winds. Additionally, the city's emergency response plans would be overhauled, with a renewed focus on coordination and communication between different agencies to ensure a faster and more efficient response in future disasters. The storm would also spark a broader conversation about climate change and the role it played in the severity of Hurricane Katrina. The disaster's impact on New York City would likely lead to an increase in discussions about rising sea levels, stronger storms, and the need for long-term environmental sustainability. The city would work towards becoming more resilient to climate change, investing in green infrastructure and exploring innovative solutions for reducing its environmental footprint. In the years following the storm, New York City would begin to rebuild itself, but the scars of Hurricane Katrina would never fully fade. The disaster would serve as a reminder of the city's vulnerability to extreme weather events, and the recovery process would be a testament to the resilience of New Yorkers. With time, the city would return to its bustling, vibrant self, but the lessons learned from the storm would shape how it prepares for and responds to future challenges. Ultimately, New York City would recover, but Hurricane Katrina's impact would remain a part of its history. The storm would forever change how the city approaches disaster preparedness, urban planning, and its response to the growing threats posed by climate change. In the face of overwhelming destruction, the city's spirit would endure, and New Yorkers would continue to rebuild stronger and more determined than before.